What I'll get you to do, does everybody have a smartphone with them today? If you don't, just sit next to someone who has one. I'm going to get you to look up this here. So it says newadvent.org/Summa, SUMMA, because we don't have a projector and I thought it'd be easier to look at the actual text that way, just to start with. I'll give you a minute to find that. All right. Hands up if you haven't found that yet. Oh, got it? That's good. All right, I'll just bring it up on mine. If you scroll down a little bit, you'll find where it says prima pars, prima secundae partis, secunda partis, tertia pars, and supplementum tertia partis. Can you see those subheadings there? All right. So as I mentioned before, these are the main parts of, you want to look this up, okay, on the phone? These are the main parts of the Summa. It's a very large work, but these are the main divisions. I just wanted to show you where the ethics sits in the Summa Theologica. Now, the Summa is not, obviously it's not his only work, but that's often the work that people go to reference. But there are other major works as well. So, I'll get a volunteer. Can I get you, Claire, to read out the titles under prima pars? Sacred Doctrine.
So, that's just those ones?
Yeah.
Sacred Doctrine, the One God, the Blessed Trinity, Creation, the Angels, 6 days, Man, the Government of Creatures.
Good, okay. So, the work as a whole of the Summa, it has this overall scheme where it begins with God, the acts of God, comes down to creation and man in particular. And then, because man is destined to return to God, it has this sort of exit and return structure. Exitus, reditus. So the ethics fits in this part here. So you'll find in that first, the titles that were just read out, Sacred Doctrine, the One God, the Blessed Trinity, that's all in the first part about what God is and his acts. And then when you go to Prima Secunda Partis, if someone else could, do you want to read that one for me? The title's under there.
Man's last end,
Yep.
Human acts, passions, habits, vice, sin, or grace.
Good. So there you'll find 95% of where Aquinas fits his ethical system, okay? Now, the Summa Theologica, as the title says, it's a theological work. However, you will find not only does he use philosophy in the theology, you'll find sections that are pretty much just philosophy, some of them, okay? But as you can tell, he does obviously then go into theological topics because he talks about grace in that section. That's one of the topics. And then you go to the next one. So you've got the second part, and then you've got two parts within the second part. The first part within the second part is the Prima Secunda Partis, and the second part within the second part is the Secunda Partis, right? And I'll read out those titles. It says Faith, Hope, Charity, Prudence, Justice, Fortitude, Temperance, and Acts which pertain to certain men. The acts which pertain to certain men, that's about, what is that about? That's about like celibacy and things, isn't it, Father? Yeah. Like
Yes.
acts that are not for everyone to worry about, but just particular to particular vocation. And then you go to the third part, and basically, when it comes to our supernatural goal, you have Christ and the church and the sacraments and all those means by which we can return to God. And then it continues in that supplement. Aquinas died before he was able to finish all of the topics, but I believe that some of them were put together by someone else after his death, and they're included in the supplement there. So obviously we're going to be focusing on the prima secunda partis, man's last end, and we'll also look at some of the parts of the secunda partis. So that would be prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Okay. Now, so that's my my comments about where it fits in the Summa as a whole. Okay. We'll come back to the website a bit later. Any questions before I move on? All right. And that overall scheme where you've got things emanating from God and returning to God, that's that Neoplatonic scheme that he inherited. So that's something that was used a lot by the scholastics. Okay. So, as I explained a lot in the other two lectures, Aquinas uses Aristotle a lot. Okay. And I also said that there are basically three different attitudes that Catholics in the past would have towards Aristotle. When Aristotle's works started to be translated more in the 13th century, there was some controversy over whether we should be using Aristotle to make sense of the Christian faith or whether we shouldn't. And Aquinas took a middle view. There were Averroists, and that's after, I don't think that's spelled right, but Averroes. Averroes is an Islamic commentator on Aristotle. And he had his own version of own version of Aristotle. And the Averroists treated Aristotle like gospel, I suppose you could say. Everything that Aristotle said was infallible and was all correct. So that's one extreme view. The other extreme view was taken up by, I guess you'd call them the Augustinians. I'm going to call it extreme Augustinians because really everyone, all the scholastics at the time were Augustinians in some way or another, because he was the tradition. He was a giant, really. They said, no, let's just look at Scripture and Augustine. We can't use Aristotle at all because it's pagan and there's problems with it. Okay? Aquinas took that middle position. So that's true also of the ethics. Okay? Now the ethics Aristotle's ethics it's a very significant work because it was the first work where a philosopher had tried to bring together systematically make a system of ethics. You had ethical sections in Plato and Socrates, but it wasn't a whole system. It didn't dive deeper. All right. So Aquinas says, this is a great resource. Let's use this. But he does make some changes. He adapts it. and he fits it into a larger system. What differences do you think Christianity makes to Aristotle ethics? In other words, what do you think would have to change or be added to Aristotle's ethics to make it more Christian? Any ideas? Yep.
Wouldn't you have to go with being made in God's image?
Yes.
Because he wouldn't have thought that.
That's right. Yep. Correct.
Well, in Christ as well.
Christ, definitely, yes. So Christ, what do we gain? What are the things that we gain through Christ that couldn't have been gained just through philosophy?
Trinity.
Yeah, an understanding of God as Trinity, that's right.
Grace.
Grace, yeah, that's the big one. So, and grace comes in two basic types, healing and elevating. So Aristotle didn't have a concept of sin. He had a concept of evil or things not being as they should, but not as a concept of original sin.
So the Averroes
Averroes, yeah.
was
Yeah.
Islamic. So was all of the interpretations of Aristotle through the light of Islam.
Yeah, that's something I don't feel confident to answer properly or fully.
Because is that what Aquinas had to see of Aristotle?
Averroism basically, so Averroes had a doctrine such as there's only one intellect. We don't all have individual intellects. And the problem with that is that then we don't have an afterlife. We don't have individual souls that go to heaven. And they believed that God necessarily created everything. It undid the concept of God being free not to create. And there's also another position on the eternity of the world. They believe the world was eternal. So later on, when you get to certain condemnations in the 1300s of certain works of Aristotle, certain positions of Aristotle, the ones that are problematic come under this category. And Aquinas filters those out, basically. Does that answer your question? I don't know how they fit it with Islam.
Because they would believe there's heaven.
Yeah, I know that there is a position where they have these, instead of, because Aquinas is very important in that he synthesizes faith and reason. They're not the same, they're different, but they complement each other and they harmonize. Over here you've got, you can get some views where on one hand you've got philosophy proving this, but then you've got scripture saying this, and they contradict each other, and somehow they're both true. I mean, it doesn't really make sense, does it? But that was a view. And Aquinas is like this. Nothing that's true, whether revealed or whether arrived at through philosophy, nothing that's true can contradict anything else that's true, Okay, where was I? We're talking about grace. So, obviously, for the idea of grace, you need, for healing grace, that needs a concept of sin. So Aquinas has a concept of sin, obviously, and he admits that we need grace to heal that, whether through baptism or the sacraments. But there's also elevating grace. So what that means is our powers and our operations can be elevated so that we can participate in the life of God and know and love things in the way that God does. We're still limited because we're human beings, but it's a supernatural life. So you're right, I can't remember which of you said that, but definitely grace is a big thing that changes, and you won't find that in Aristotle. So definitely Aquinas has to make some changes But still he manages to draw a lot on Aristotle a lot in the system. Another one I just want to mention before we move on is humility. Why there's a lot that's good in the classical Greek tradition that we still draw on in Catholic ethics. There are limitations, and one of them is their understanding of greatness. When you come to Christianity, you have what's called a transvaluation. That's a word that you'll only see in contemporary literature, but I think it's a good one. Transvaluation, that means values are shifted around. So only in Christianity will you get the view that every single human being is made in the image of God, is precious in themselves. Only with Christianity will you get the view that somebody could be totally insignificant in the eyes of the world and yet still have very noble value. From the classical ancient Greek viewpoint, some versions at least, greatness was the apex, the best possible life would be one of glory where humans recognize you for how good you are, what deeds you've done. So you'll find Homer comes quite before Aristotle in a different age, but you'll find in Homer that people want to die in battle for the glory that they would receive. So the way that Christians understand human glory is not in terms of the glory that we receive from other human beings, but it's a different glory that requires humility and the way of the cross. Grasp that point? Yeah, the ancient Greek understanding of greatness is different from the Christian view. So when Aquinas is bringing in Christianity into his ethics, he does have to change that as well. More emphasis on humility. But having said all that, there's still, as I said, there's a lot that comes in. And here are some the Greek terms. I just want to focus on the main Greek terms. Some of the main Greek terms that you'll find in Aristotle's ethics. The first is eudaimonia. That's a difficult word to translate, but it's a central word for the ethics. In a way, it's probably the basic word, or the basic concept. Does anybody know what it means?
Does it come from the same place as euphoria?
No, but the EU does. So the EU part, the prefix, means good. That's why eucalyptus, EU, means beautiful or good. It means good. Daimonia is to do with spirit or God. And from what I've read, Aristotle doesn't draw much on the etymology, but it's to do with, in the eyes of gods, or in the eyes of God, you're living well. You're leading a good life according to a divine perspective. But the etymology is not as important. It's just, how does Aristotle use the word? Well, it translates to happiness and flourishing. You've got to think of these two together. And also sometimes blessedness. Sometimes. So happiness, when we use the term in English, often the emphasis is on how you're feeling. And especially in the modern world, which has been affected by liberalism and And the idea that you need to find your own way and your understanding of truth is your own and my truth is my truth, your truth is your truth. You've got to do what makes you happy. That's what you call subjectivism. But happiness here, there are objective standards. Aristotle is definitely about objective standards for ethics. All right. Does anyone have a guess on how does Aristotle find objective standards for how to live a life, a human life? Where would those standards come from? Well, remember I talked before about how nature works in Aristotle. So different things have different natures. So a horse has a nature. It's the nature of a horse to do the things that horses do. Same with dogs, same with plants, and human beings. So human beings have got a specific nature, okay? Now, what is distinctive about human beings compared to animals? What's distinctive about human beings compared to animals?
They can make choices.
Can make choices.
Will and intellect.
Will and intellect, good. So reason, basically, another way of saying it, the same thing, intellect or reason. So, still, this is all Aristotle still. Ergon means function, or the distinctive way that something operates. So the distinctive function, the distinctive ergon of the human being is reason. Function. So, if you want to know how a human being can be truly happy, truly flourish, you need to know what is the distinctive function of a human being. The distinctive function of a human being is to act rationally, act in accordance with reason, okay? So that means, while dogs and cats, for them to be flourishing, doing well as dogs and cats can, they can run on instinct, but they don't use reason, properly speaking. But man does have to use reason, okay? Does that make sense so far? So just to recap, Aristotle's ethics starts with the concept of happiness or flourishing, and then he asks, well, what is the distinctive function of man? And it is using reason or acting according to reason. So if you're acting well according to reason, then you will be happy. All right. Okay. What do you need though in order to act according to reason?
Well, hasn't he just sort of shifted the post there a little bit? Because now you've got to find out what makes good reason.
That's right.
Good,
Yeah. He's sort of saying, well, how do we do ethics? We do ethics by looking. I've missed out a step. I'll just fill it in now. What is the primary good? He asks. Ethics is about choosing good things. When you're living ethically, when you're choosing things that are actually good, but you're doing this in an ordered, reasonable way. Okay. So Aristotle wants to know first, so what is the primary good? And he distinguishes between, you can find a good that you're doing for its own sake, but you also have goods that you're doing for the sake of something else, all right? When you're eating a hamburger, is that your primary good, objectively speaking? Are you doing that for the sake of something else? Or is that the meaning of your whole life, to sit there and eat hamburgers? No, it's not, okay? So, and this is the reasoning Aquinas takes this as well. There are goods that we do for the sake of something else, but if you keep asking why someone did that, they'll always come back to, well, I did it because I'm looking for happiness. So what Aristotle says, and Aquinas agrees, if you ask someone why they did something, and you keep asking them, they'll always come back to, well, I did it because I want to be happy, looking for happiness. But remember, when you're reading these translations, you can't always assume that happy means exactly the same as what we mean by it in English. So you just got to remember, it's to do with flourishing. Okay? And for Aristotle and Aquinas, built into the human being is the search for happiness, the desire for happiness. We don't have a say in that. It's just how we're built. All right? What we do have a choice in is the means that we use, the means that we choose in order to get toward happiness. All right? Any questions before I go on? And Aquinas makes a distinction, just to jump ahead, sorry. Aquinas makes a distinction between the general concept of happiness and when you fill in that concept with an interpretation of what happiness consists in. Everyone is searching for happiness, according to Aquinas. Sound reasonable? But different people are searching for happiness. Different people have different approaches to what happiness is and how they search for it. Okay. So in some people, they've decided irrationally that the accumulation of wealth is what ultimate happiness consists in. For others, it will be physical beauty. For others, it would be fame, comfort, so on. Does that make sense? So you've got a general concept of happiness, but then you've got the concrete interpretations of what happiness consists in. And for Aquinas, everyone is searching for happiness, but that doesn't mean everyone is searching for what true happiness. We don't have a natural inclination toward what happiness truly consists in. Is that right?
Well, I think you would say that we can certainly search for happiness in the wrong things, yes. But I think that would be contrary to our nature. And
Yeah.
That would be the point.
Yeah.
So you can choose it, but
Yeah.
you're really acting contrary to reason
Yeah.
if you're doing that. Yeah, so.
Yeah, okay. But what I'd like to point out, though, is that you can't just rely on your instinct to be fulfilled. You can't just say, well, I'm going to let my nature find its way. You have to use your reason. And also it becomes more complicated because of the fact of sin, and we're in society where we're influenced by incorrect ideas. Sorry, this looks all very messy. I'm going to sort of rub that off. I'm sorry if I'm jumping back and forth a bit. The next concept, arete, that just means excellence. So Aristotle talks about an artisan or an artist who's making something, or a carpenter making something. When something's made very well, it's excellent. It has arete. Okay. Now, for humans to be excellent, they need virtue. Virtue. So the concept of virtue goes back to Aristotle, probably even earlier, but Aristotle certainly made a system out of it. A virtue is a disposition, basically, a disposition to act well. Whoops. And it's a habit. It's a good habit. And as you know, when you act well, say you get up on time for a long time, 40 days in a row, you get up on time 40 days in a row, that becomes a good habit. you practice acts that are courageous, so you don't chicken out of things, that becomes a habit. Okay, so in Aristotle's system that Aquinas takes, you've got a substance which is just a thing that exists, so the human being. And then that substance has powers or faculties. And those powers or faculties have acts, operations, but in this middle part here you've got habits. So you can have a good habit in forming, say, so you've got the will and the intellect. You can have a good habit that's informing the will, or a good habit that's informing the intellect. I'll just stick with intellect for a second. So since you're learning philosophy, you're building up a habit of the mind. So philosophy is a habit. Good philosophy is a good habit. Because when we use our faculties, we don't just use them in the raw, except when we're very young and we're children or babies. They become adjusted and disposed in certain ways so that we act in certain ways. And a person's character obviously depends on what sort of habits they have, whether they're good or bad. But Aristotle says there are habits of the intellect and there are habits of the will. And they involve the emotions as well. But when we come to ethics, we're focusing more on the practical rather than the theoretical. So habits of the will and the emotions and the intellect, but only the practical side of it. So we can use our intellect, we have to use our intellect to make good decisions ethically, and that's the practical intellect. We also can use the intellect to know things for their own sake, just because we're curious or want to build up a system of how things are. And that's the theoretical intellect. So, who knows what the 4 cardinal virtues are?
Prudence, justice, fortitude,
Very good. Okay. So, we've inherited that in the Catechism. It comes all the way back to Aristotle, maybe even before that. What does the Catholic tradition add on top of that?
Theological.
Yeah, which are?
Faith, hope and love.
Okay, good. So when we're looking at Aristotle's ethics, we're only looking at those 4 cardinal virtues. And they're the 4 main ones that Aristotle looks at in his ethics. And he understands those virtues in accordance with this doctrine of the mean. I'm just going to touch on. One example of how that works is a courageous person avoids these 2 extremes. One extreme is to be too not willing enough to put himself in danger of being harmed or being insulted or being offended. Okay? So, but that's one extreme, so that's being too timid. But you can go to the other extreme, and that's being foolhardy, and that's just rushing into danger too much. And that's another extreme. So, courage is finding the mean in different situations. Does that make sense so far? And I won't go into the details of how the other virtues work like that, but Aristotle would say the other virtues work like that too. Now, Aristotle certainly says that this is not just based on just intuition and instinct. There are reasoning processes involved, okay? On the other hand, I'm just going to make sure I'm being recorded. Yep. On the other hand, Aristotle says that two things. One is you can't write down everything as a complete system of ethics and then from that expect that you'll know exactly what to do in every situation, because it's impossible to write down. It's impossible to cover for every concrete situation, okay? There are rules and principles, and there are norms that don't have exceptions, but still, I mean, that makes sense. Life is very messy and complicated, okay? How do we manage that? Well, if you build up a good character, you will then have this, what Aquinas calls connatural knowledge. And what it's to do with phronesis. So phronesis is a way of knowing how to act in different situations. You haven't come across that exact situation before, but you've got a sensibility that allows you to judge what to do. All right? So if if you've been formed well and you've built up your character well, and also particularly if you've got good examples and leaders in your life, wise people, you would have built up a good character. And then when you're thrown into a situation that you haven't thought about before, you can work out what to do, okay? So that gap between theory and practice can be crossed with character, with phronesis. And Aquinas agrees, basically, and he talks about connatural knowledge. Connatural means it just flows out of your nature. In this case, we're talking about second nature. First and second nature is an important concept as well. The good thing about the concept of second nature is we use that in English, so we know what it means. Something becomes second nature when you've done it so many times, it just becomes easy to do. So when you've learnt to ride a bike or learnt how to drive a car, or learn how to parent, it to a certain extent becomes second nature. You're not learning it. When you first become a parent, it's something you've got to be very conscious of. What do I do now? How do I do it? And you're thinking a lot about it. It's difficult. Same with driving a car. But after a while, you become your mind and your emotions and your brain all become adapted to it, so it becomes easier. And connatural knowledge is a knowledge that comes out of second nature. Think about the chess masters. They have connatural knowledge of what to do. They've practiced so much that the game of chess, that they just have a connatural knowledge of what's the best move to do. Yep. Okay, so we've looked at those 4 virtues. And the beauty of this general scheme is that it fits really well into the basic outline here. It fits very well into Catholic theology. And Aquinas takes this and then he talks about the supernatural virtues using the same scheme. All right? Has everyone got that down? Can I write it up? Yeah. So it's a bit silly that I rubbed it out first, but you've got your substance, which is It's the thing that exists with a certain nature. It's got powers or faculties. Then they're informed by habits. And then you've got actions or operations of those faculties. There's a fifth thing I didn't mention, sorry, and that's the object. So different powers are different objects. So the object of the will is the good. Object of the intellect is the truth, or things that are intelligible. And the object of, say, perception is things that can be seen or touched, etc. So that's it's a scheme with 5 parts. Aquinas takes that and he makes sense of the supernatural virtues in those terms. But there's a couple of differences between Aristotle's virtues and the theological virtues. So we've got, they're called the acquired virtues. So, faith, hope and charity, we believe that when a baby is baptised, that baby is given these virtues, even though they've never practiced them. That's right, isn't it? Faith, hope and charity? Yep. But they don't have courage or prudence or justice or fortitude. These virtues you build up through practice. It's like the end result of a natural process. You build. It's like going to the gym, basically. Did you have a question? Or no? It's like think of it as going to the gym. You build up the strength, or think of it like learning a science or a skill. Whereas the infused virtues, they're a gift that just come into the soul. I don't want to go more about that because we start getting into theology. But Aquinas definitely thinks about faith, hope and virtue in terms of the powers or faculties of the human person and their distinctive objects. All right. We're about halfway through. Any questions before I move on? Comments? No?
I'm just going to maybe you talked about happiness as the end of man, but what does happiness consist in?
Yeah.
So,
Yep.
according to Aristotle.
According to Aristotle? Well, as I said in very general terms, happiness consists in acting according to... Yeah, haven't filled in this gap yet. Happiness consists in acting according to reason. In order to act in accordance with reason, you need to have the correct habits. And with Aristotle, you've got a bit of a tension because on one hand, he says that contemplation of the truth is the highest good. So for somebody who has the opportunity, this would be the ideal, and it would be doing philosophy for him. However, in terms of living our lives, Aristotle puts other things in there in terms of what's required to be happy, and he includes friendship, virtues, a certain degree of health, a certain degree of money. He doesn't say that money. He's not saying that money is the ultimate end or thing that happiness consists in, but we need a certain amount of it to be happy. There was something else I was going to add there. Ah, yes. One other thing that definitely is a huge contrast between Aristotle and Christianity is that Aristotle is saying that only men can achieve this. Free men. And he reads that into the nature of things. He says it's just the nature of things that men are able to philosophize well, but women can't do that. And unfortunately, also he would say that slaves, they don't have the opportunity to do philosophy either, and that's just the nature of things. Some people are not destined to reach this highest good. You can see how that's different to how Christians would see things. Christianity in that respect is much more, I guess, democratic, because we believe that every human person is called to the ultimate good, which would be holiness in heaven. Okay, whereas Aristotle's is definitely that definitely the view where some people are just destined to have a lesser existence. Yeah.
So like hierarchical in worth, not just in like what they're capable of achieving.
Yeah, it's the word hierarchy is because some hierarchies are good and other hierarchies are not good. So the hierarchy between whites and blacks, or men can think better than women can, they're ones that are problematic. But what we're saying, worth, yeah, some people are worth, intrinsic worth is greater than others. Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean by some people's intrinsic worth is greater? Well, think about the word place. What's the place? The place of a man who's free, so not a slave. The place of a free man is to be able to philosophize, contemplate, or participate in politics as well. So they have the place that they occupy in society is a higher place, and therefore they've got a greater worth. Whereas a slave or a woman, they've got a lower place in society. It doesn't have as much dignity. How does Christianity change it? Well, Christianity still differentiates between men and women, but it elevates everything. Even the things that are humble have infinite worth, because it can be our own way of holiness. Am I making sense there? Yeah.
So I just made a comment, not less than a question, more a comment on that. Yeah, I've often thought that just the Christian concept that we're all equal before God is sort of about the most radical idea there's ever been.
Definitely.
I don't think it actually doesn't come to people naturally. I think
No.
Aristotle's idea of
No, you're right.
people being superior to others is probably where we are naturally without being taught by
Totally.
God that we're all equal, yes.
Complete. And what's ironic is that progressives today are actually drawing on the Christian idea, that everyone has got their own worth, and they're being anti-Christian, but they're drawing on Christianity at the same time. Yeah. So it is easy for us to forget how radical the idea is. It comes very natural to us because we've been brought up in it, that everyone's made in the image of God. But yeah, if you're born in a different culture or a different time, it's not necessarily intuitive to you that people shouldn't be slaves, for example. So where was I? So yeah, Aristotle includes different things in terms of what it takes to be happy. And politics comes in here, at least for men, participation in society. All right, I'm just going to look at the next topic. So what I'm going to do is just say some brief comments about what the natural law is for Aquinas and how it fits into ethics. to save time, I'm going to read it straight out rather than getting you to look it up. So I'm looking at the Summa Theologica, first part of the second part, so 2.1, and question 91. And this is about the various kinds of law. So we've got eternal law, natural law, human law, and divine law. All right. So there's a definition that Aquinas has of what law is. Law is a dictate of practical reason emanating from the ruler who governs a perfect community or governs a community. Okay, let's go through those elements of what law is. It's a dictate. So a dictate means something that you have to do of reason. So this is important. It's important that reason is included in his definition of law because he's avoiding this thing called voluntarism. Now, a voluntaristic point of view is that, well, God is arbitrary, and whatever he decides is good. That's what's good, just because he said it. So if God could have commanded us to hate each other, God could have, done anything. But the other view, which is that law is based on reason, that's why it's important that Aquinas is including reason in his understanding of law, because in order to have a good law, it has to be based on reason. And things are based on reason when they reflect the nature of things, when they harmonise with the order of things, the natural order of things. So I'll keep going. It's a dictate of reason, or practical reason. So not theoretical reason, but practical reason. It comes from a ruler, and it's for the sake of the community. So dictate of reason. Comes from a ruler who's in charge of a community, and it's for the good of the community. So laws are not, they don't focus on individuals or specific groups. They're just about the order of the community as a whole, right? So you don't have a law that's a law for Michael White. There's no law for Michael. That is your surname, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. Now, you won't find a law that's just directed to you. The laws are more universal in scope. All right, so when Aquinas is asked, is there an eternal law? Aquinas says yes, because there is a ruler, the ruler is God. God acts in accordance with reason. The community is basically the universe, and the good of the community is the order of the universe. So the eternal law is basically his government of creatures, his providence and government, his keeping things in order. And obviously a big part of that is the way that he gives things different natures. Right? So that's the eternal law. Think of the eternal law as God governing creation. And that includes his giving things different natures and keeping them in good order. All right. Now, when we get to the concept of natural law, Aquinas states that you can be governed by God, by the eternal law, in two different ways. In one way, you're doing it the way that plants, animals, and the elements would do it is they don't interiorize, they don't appropriate the law rationally. What they do, when dogs do what dogs do, when cats do what cats do, when plants do what they do, they are reflecting God's wisdom, but they're not thinking about it. They're not aware of what they're doing rationally. But man alone is able and is called to make that law his own. Okay? So we're making the eternal law or God's wisdom our own by understanding it and accepting it. And the natural law really is the eternal law, but it's this is running out. It's natural law from our perspective, from our limited perspective, is the eternal law. It's as far as we can understand the eternal law, that's the natural law. And so the natural law is imprinted in the nature of things. And because we can recognize God's order in things, and we can see that it's good and follow it, it's for us. It's a natural law that we can follow. Any questions on that? Any other things to add there?
I suppose the definition, rational participation in the eternal law. So it is a sharing in it, as you said. Yes, it's a rational, we're not determined to follow that law. We can actually know it.
So I think it'll make more sense to you if we give some examples of natural law arguments. So a natural law argument this is as far as I understand it, and it's not my area of expertise, so you might have to add a better example if mine isn't that good. But something that's been topical in the last decade is marriage and the nature of marriage. And obviously it's been debated a lot whether the concept of marriage, the traditional concept of marriage, is between one man, one woman for life, and Catholics traditionally the relation to children is in there. Catholics, compared to other religions, I think Catholics have a stronger sense of how important the children are for a marriage. So, to see why this is how we should define marriage, one way of doing it is to see what happens to a society, or what would happen to a society when marriage is undermined. So, what would happen? What would happen if you were to arrange societies so that you could have, it was considered normal for a man to raise a child alone, was considered normal for a single woman to raise children alone? Or what about the government? You could have a system where the government are raising the children. Or another system you could have is the children just go from one family to another or one person to another, that people take turns, okay? Now when we think about it, we can see that these are not ideal and some of them are disordered. So by reflecting on the consequences of compromising this are societies in which children are not raised as well as they could be, and that has all sorts of knock-on effects. The way that I think about natural law is what's sustainable, right? Now, when you hear that word sustainable, people are going to think about, well, does that mean the environment? And yeah, which some of that is natural law based. But what I mean by sustainable is something that will work from generation to generation to generation, and society will still have order in it. If unfaithfulness, if it's considered normal and acceptable for men to be unfaithful, or for women to be unfaithful, or for men and women to divorce whenever they feel like it, how does that affect society? And from a Catholic point of view, and even from just a natural reason point of view, you can argue, no, it doesn't work. There are all sorts of things. Society starts to break down. So, how am I arguing this way? Well, these are natural law arguments because we're not bringing in scripture or dogma. We're just trying to look at what are the consequences if we have a society where this is held as sacred versus the consequences of when we don't. And unfortunately, modern men, they want to tamper with these designs, and they feel that these ideals or these norms are offensive to their freedom, and they want to go their own way, and then all sorts of negative effects happen in society, and people still don't want to admit that because we've had so much divorce, because we've had a separation between child rearing and the sexual act, those two have become separated. That's had all sorts of knock-on effects that are negative. Do you want me to go through that argument about the separation of the sexual act and child raising? So, especially since the 1960s, the idea has become very prevalent that men and women should be able to just enjoy sex, and the responsibility and the duty and the honour of raising children is something else. It's a secondary consideration, but you should be able to do this as much as you like in the way that you feel like, whenever you like, and children don't come into it. Well, what are the consequences of that? Abortion, yeah. Abortion. What other consequences?
Broken families.
Yeah, which then has all sorts of knock-on effects. And that has economic effects. You know, the way that the family arrangements, and just think about mental illness. How much does that cost the government? And that's one of the knock-on effects of broken down society and families not being together and so forth.
Demographics.
Yeah, demographics. So think about, you need younger generations to support the elder people who are in hospitals or on the pension and so forth. That's a natural law argument as well. You know, natural law, if we were doing things according to God's wisdom, then there would be a good portion of younger generation being able to support the older people, but It's not the way it is at the moment. All right.
Could you say that the natural law comes into a lot of the Ten Commandments?
Definitely, yeah.
Or all of them? Or not all of them?
Yeah,
So is that God?
Father might be able to help better than me.
Yes, Thomas says all of them,
All of them.
except the only one is the third one in terms of keep holy the Sabbath, because natural law doesn't tell you which day of the week to keep holy. That is by revelation. But what is according to natural law is we do worship God, and we do, yes. Now, on what day we do that keep is something man determines, or well, in this case, God determines it, and it's revealed that is on the Sabbath. But all the Ten Commandments fall under the natural law.
Yeah.
All right, so there are some really powerful resources or ideas that you can use in Aquinas' natural law theory to make arguments these days. Someone who's an evangelical Protestant, you know, with all respect to them, because they're great in many ways, they will often just quote scripture. There's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes you want something that's got more substance about, you know, you want to philosophize a bit about why something is not good, and just saying that, well, it's in the Bible, that's not always going to be.
You argue that's fairly useless. You don't believe
Sometimes.
the Bible.
Sometimes,
where
yeah.
It's, the arguments never get the first square.
Yeah.
It's like speaking a different language to
Yeah.
someone.
I still think we should preaching's fine, but yeah. I think we should have both. Yeah. So Catholics are in a good position because we've got a strong natural law tradition. Evangelicals, not so much. They're not really a fan of Aristotle or using philosophy as such. You'll have other traditions that are in the middle. Okay, before I just wanted to move and compare Aquinas' achievement with some of the other ethical positions that are had in modern times. But before I moved, any questions or any comments you want to make, Father? So, if I were to give a course on ethics, I would run through these other systems, the three main systems. Utilitarianism is one. That's right. So utility here just means pleasure or happiness. But happiness is really just the experience of happiness or pleasure. So I'll come back to this in a minute. But utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill was one of the main guys who did that back in the 19th century. And it says we should always act in such a way that we maximize the amount of happiness of society as a whole. All right? I'll repeat that. That's a system where we should always act, or governments should create policies in such a way that there's the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. All right? Now, what do you think of that idea? Good, bad?
I was thinking about it before actually. Did he try to get it from Aristotle and his idea of like pursuing happiness and good, and then just sort of expanded it to that should be its virtue, or?
No, because once you get to modern times, you've got the idea of happiness becomes separated from nature in a lot of ways. So happiness becomes more of an experience, like the feeling of happiness.
Rather than
He's not purely subjective, but Aristotle would say that certain things are just always wrong. thing about utilitarianism is that really, if the circumstances call for it, you could do anything. Right?
Means to an end type thing.
Yeah. So if by torturing you, I could avoid a bad outcome, then you should do it, or you can at least do it. But Catholic doctrine and Aristotle even say, no, there are some acts where they're just innately evil. You can't do them under any circumstances. I'll repeat that. Catholic doctrine says some acts are just by their very nature evil. Some acts by their very nature are evil, so that under any circumstances under no circumstances can we do them. And the best resource there, I don't have the chapter, that was John Paul II, 1990 something, I think. And he really drives that home there, and it's a really good paragraph if you can find it, that there are some acts that, to repeat again, some acts that are just always evil and we can't do them for any reason, and abortion is one of them. Okay? Removing the child out of the mother's womb because her life is in danger, that's not abortion, because your intent is not to kill the child. It's an important point. So, because I'm making that point because if I were to say, to people on the internet, a person in general society, if I were to say abortion is always evil, they would say, well, what about when, the woman's life's in danger and you have to remove the child? I say, well, your intent is not to kill the child, because the child doesn't have to die in order for the woman's life to be saved. It just has to be removed. If the child then happens to die, that's another thing. All right. Back to the point was that there are some absolute moral norms. Absolute norms. This is something that's actually I'm very interested in this, and I think it's very important today for Catholics to remember. For two reasons. One is general society will deny it. Second is that there are some people within the church, theologians, even some bishops, a couple of cardinals, who will deny this. And they will say that, if the circumstances are complicated, abortion's okay, or, cohabitation's okay. All right? It's very subtle because they're not saying morality is totally subjective. They're still agreeing that there are objective morals, but they're saying, well, we have to be flexible and there's no such thing as these. Okay? And does anyone know the name of that theory?
Seamless garment.
It's related. Proportionalism. So this cropped up after Humana Vitae. And that was some liberal moral theologians wanted to say, well, no, in some circumstances it's okay to do these things that the church has said we shouldn't be doing. So the church's position has been, no, some things, not all things, but some things are absolutely forbidden. Some liberal theologians are saying, no, maybe under some circumstances it's okay. And that view is proportionalism. I think it's important to understand what this is, because it's creeping back in another form at the moment. Questions?
Just a bit more of a technical question. Was it that were they saying that outright right? That yes, it is okay in these circumstances, or was it more a bit of a weaseling of, oh, under these circumstances we shouldn't be so quick to judge, or like, you know, it should be allowed under these things even though it's normally wrong.
They're very similar points of view, yeah. Because you've got
I've heard a lot of that second one.
The second one's to do with pastoral practice. Yeah, that's a whole other story. I'm not really qualified to talk about it.
It was a situation ethics.
Yeah.
Like Fletcher and so on. So
Sorry, that's what I meant to say.
yeah.
But they're very...
Because proportionalism is different, it's more of a consequentialism.
Sorry, that's what I meant to say. Okay? The wrong word came out of my mind. This is related, but it's different. Situation ethics, yeah. Is every situation is unique, and there's no universal principles that apply to everything. There's just a general principle, which is, well, Fletcher, who came out with this, he's an Anglican, he said, love of neighbour is the universal, but what that amounts to is just do what's loving in each situation, you know. And while on the surface that's right, the way it becomes, you know, weaselly. What does this have to do with Aquinas? Well, Aquinas says there are certain types of acts that are always wrong. Because Aquinas looks at, and this is going to have to be I'll look at Kant for a second, and then these four parts of Aquinas' moral act. Aquinas looks at the nature of the act itself, and as I said, some acts, the nature of them is just inherently against God's law and inherently offensive to God, or inherently against reason and nature. The language that's used in Aquinas and even before that, you'll see in Shakespeare even, and in Aquinas talk about acts against nature. You can guess what that is. But the very language is quite telling, isn't it? It's an act that by its very nature there's something off about it. All right. And I think that sense of horror and repulsion of something that's unnatural meaning it goes against the universe, goes against the order of things. I think it's a great perspective to have, but that's being worn down, and today people tend not to think that way. I think we should. Aquinas also looks at what is your motivation for doing an act. So the nature could be good, but you're doing it for the wrong reasons. So giving charity because I want others to notice it is one example. So that's to do with your intention in doing it. The third is the circumstances. So some things could be normally good, but in a certain circumstance not right. So it's good to... I think stand-up comedy is very good when done well. I think it's important, but you wouldn't do it in a church. All right. Any other examples of things that are good, but in certain circumstances not right?
And giving someone painkillers is generally a good thing, but if you're doing it to deliberately OD them and euthanize them, it's generally not.
Well, that would be the intention.
Mm.
Yeah, that's the intention.
Self-defense.
Self-defense, yeah. Circumstances, yeah. Whether something's right or wrong, or legal or illegal, does depend on circumstances. So the use of a gun. So we've got circumstances, the nature of the act, your intention, and my goodness, I've forgotten the fourth one.
They're the three objects. The three sources of morality: object, end, circumstance.
So there's only three.
Yeah.
Where did I think it was four? Yeah, and Aquinas says for an act to be good, all those three have to be in place. And unfortunately, whenever you only need one of them to fall away for an act to be bad. And when we've got those concepts in our minds, we can see why utilitarianism is wrong. There's no way of... In utilitarianism, you can't say that any act is intrinsically wrong. It just always depends on the circumstance. An example that's given in that Fletcher gives, which is quite interesting, is that he gives the example of a woman who is being imprisoned in Russia in World War II, but she wants to get back to her family. And she decides to, I'm sure this has happened, she decides to sleep with one of the prison guards because there is a rule that if one of the women are pregnant, they can be allowed to go home from prison. Okay? And from, you can see why that's an understandable thing to do. If you really want to get out of prison and you want to go home and look after your family, you could see why that would be tempting to do. But according to Aquinas, no, that act is intrinsically evil, and no matter how good the consequences are, you still can't do it. Right? Situation ethics would say, well, no, she's doing it because she loves her family. All right? See how it works? It sort of weasels its way. It's really utilitarianism in a way, isn't it? All right. Then we'll go on to Kant. I'm sure there's a fourth one.
I'm not aware of.
This deserves a whole lecture, but it's difficult. It's very influential. So, 1700s, Puritan. Was he pietist? Pietist, sorry. So it's type of Protestantism. He was Prussian. Think of there's a caricatured view of Germans that are, they don't have a sense of humour. It's not true. Germans are not, but the caricature. They don't have a sense of humour. They're very organised, they're regimented. They want to create order everywhere. Think of that starts to help you understand what Kant is about. So for Kant, ethics is all about reason, but it has nothing to do with emotions or virtue or nature. So he creates this split, this dualism. It's really grotesque in the end, the ethics, because he's saying that if you're acting out of inclination, or if you're expressing emotions, that has nothing to do with morality. And morality is just about doing your duty. Your duty. Just do your duty. All right? And your duty is to do with following universal norms. So a universal norm is one where you can will to do something and at the same time will that everyone else does it. And it's consistent. Now, while there are aspects of that there's truth in it, the problem is that there's no room here for a formation of character, for the formation of emotions and virtues. And it's sort of a bit against nature as well. Whereas Aristotle and Aquinas, the beauty of their systems is that ethics is about forming nature, forming a second nature, and forming characters, which mean if you have a good character, then you'll love the right things. And when you're acting ethically, it's an expression. It can be an expression of your own character and your own love for things. So there's a warmth to it. This becomes a bit cold and mechanical. I haven't really done full justice to it, but I thought I'd just try and give you some sense of what's wrong with it.
can sort of see where the idea of I was only following orders comes from, and why Britain and America didn't buy that as an excuse, because we're not under Kant's sort of influence like the Germans are. I'm just probably I missed something.
Something in that,
but-
yeah. Something in that. I think I'll leave it there. Unless you feel free to add anything or.
No, just about Kant. Because in a way, he tries to, with the categorical imperative, he tries to bring out a universal ethic. Because he's saying, well, don't do anything which cannot be also a universal norm. So, if, for example, you want to steal money in order to get ahead, he would say, well, can you make that a universal norm? That is to say, if everyone stole money, what would society be like? So in a way, he's trying to universalize it. He's not doing it not by referring to nature, like St. Thomas, but he is in a way trying to bring it in. But I don't agree with that's the correct way to do it. But
Because what he's done, he's become Kant's system. His epistemology is totally flawed because he's saying we don't have insight into the nature of things. So then you're stuck with, well, okay, what's our morality based in? So he tries to find this other system that's based on reason but is divided from nature. And it becomes, it's a bit Gnostic in that sense because it's saying that we have this rational being that's totally divorced from our embodied existence. All right, questions, comments?
I guess the end point of like how he sort of sees how things would be done in that, wouldn't it just mean then whoever could exert the greatest sort of amount of like force, whether it be like, physical, like military or like social pressure?
No.
Wouldn't that be like, wouldn't that be like whoever's rules for society would then be the ones that are most upheld then, or?
No, that would be more like more of Nietzsche, that sort of thing. That would be might is right. Kant wouldn't agree with that. Kant would want to create a system where Kant is trying to do this. You've had the wars of religion, so you've had the Reformation, and then you've had these terrible wars of religion where different denominations with their different views would kill each other, basically. And so, understandably, intellectuals in Europe want to say, well, how does humanity keep surviving after this? So they want to come up with a system where everyone can agree on these common principles. So he's trying to come up with
Universalist system.
a universal ethics that's not based on tradition. There's no tradition about it, that any reasonable person would agree with. All right? But also in that, you've just had Descartes and Isaac Newton, and nature has become reduced to mechanisms. The physical world has been reduced in people's minds and in science to just atoms moving in a void, basically, mechanisms. There's no intrinsic natures, they're just forces. So you had Isaac Newton, who was able to put mathematics to great use in understanding nature and predicting the movements of things, and all sorts of other success that happened from the scientific revolution. So people started thinking of nature in these really reduced terms. So nature was no longer how Aristotle thought of it, which is in terms of teleology and forms, but just mechanisms. So you've got two things going on. Nature doesn't provide any norms. And then you've had the epistemological problem, which is that we don't actually have insight into the real natures of things anyway. So where do you go from there to found an ethics? And what Kant tries to do is you could see it like this. This is one way of looking at it. It's like a Gnostic system because it's not based on real things in the world, human natures or the natures of animals or plants or anything else in the physical world. It's based in this other purely ideal realm. And the problem with that is that then if you come up with the wrong system, then you want to impose that on everything. And because you don't have a concept of nature, you're not going to respect the order of things that God's given. You can just impose things, violently even.
So, yeah, I suppose that kind of circles around a bit then, because if you separate from like nature and the divine, like the nurture and the rest, wouldn't you? Kind of end up going for Marty's right anyway by the time.
Yeah, you're right.
Because
totally.
That would be the only way you could.
Yeah, definitely. So, on one hand, you've got what Kant would have agreed with. Right, Kant wouldn't have agreed with that. He was trying to avoid that. But the inevitable outcome of his way of thinking is Marty's right, and the imposition, the violent imposition of our ideas onto nature and onto people. And that argument has been made that Kant sets that up. Yeah.
Sort of a relativism, say, into moral relativism, has its roots in a major way in Kant. Because if we don't discover natures, according to him, we don't discover what nature, the natures of things, we impose it by our categories of thoughts. So in the moral order as well, we impose the moral categories onto reality. We don't discover those values in nature. Yes, and that opens up relativism, and those in power can impose on their understanding of what things should be.
Very related is this thing called liberalism. Now, this means different things to different people, but liberalism is a political system where you've got to allow everyone to have their own point of view and their own religion. You've got to sort of make it neutral so that everyone can coexist in the same political order, okay? But you want to do this in a way, it's basically in a Kantian way, so you're not allowed to have any concept of what nature is. You can't have any concept of what the good is, because in liberalism there's no substantive concept of what the good is or what human flourishing is. You're not allowed to stand up and say, in order to flourish as a human being, you need to do X, Y, and Z. You're not allowed in our society because that's imposing your philosophy on other people. So liberalism wants to create this so-called neutral space. And the problem then is, how do you create a political system and a social order in which all these different points of view can somehow all be embraced at the same time? So the ethics becomes, we can say, it's sort of empty and procedural. Procedural, because the rules that you're creating are just so that people don't impose on each other. There's no particular, they would say there's no particular philosophy of life that's being supported here. We just want to create a space where everyone can just have different points of view, and so that no one ends up imposing on others, all right? That's what they want to do. What actually is the case is this is a philosophy of life. So they're actually imposing a philosophy of life on people. Yeah.
That's political correctness, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
To the extreme.
Yeah, it's political, in my view, and it's the right view, is there are different phases of liberalism. Okay, so you've got people like Jordan Peterson, Douglas Murray. They would be called more classical liberals. Okay, they wouldn't have. They would call themselves anti-woke. They're still liberal, sort of Kantian influenced, but they disagree with the extent that the progressives go to, because progressives are very religious and irrational and want to break down free speech. Okay, So from their point of view, someone like Douglas Murray, and I love Douglas Murray, from his point of view, we need to go back to that type of liberalism. Okay. From my point of view, once you open up Pandora's box, it inevitably leads to progressivism that we have today. So you've got an evolution of liberalism from this classical version of liberalism to the sorts of wokeism, so-called wokeism that we see today. You know, there are people, as much as I admire them, who want to oppose progressivism, but the way that they want to oppose it is go back to the Enlightenment, or more Kant, or more John Locke. I don't think that's going to work. I think we need to go even deeper back to natural law.
Did Kant take off quite quickly? Did his philosophy take off quite quick? Because at first it seems it would in fact unite a lot of people who were at war and groups at that point in time. Because really it's just it's being like, oh, what you believe there is the same as these guys and everyone. You have actually in fact got something in common. That might have at first, with and obviously not so much in practice, because over time then you've got emotions, virtue, and the nature of the situation is taken out of it. But it seems like at first, on a base level, it might have done good if it took off.
Well, yeah, I think this is more history and sociology, but it's to do with the privatization of religion. So in the medieval way of doing it, religion was very much a public thing. So we're in a secular liberal order at the moment, but back in the Middle Ages, I mean, the concept of, just think of the concept of Christendom. So Christendom is a particular viewpoint. It's the right viewpoint, but it's a particular viewpoint on how to live your life. And it is held up as the norm for everyone to follow. See how that's not liberalism? On one hand, it's not liberalism, but in a hidden way, liberalism is actually imposing their philosophy of life. But they don't believe, they claim that they're not. What's happened is, the Kantian point of view wants to try and allow people to get along with each other and accommodate differences of religious persuasion by making religion a private thing. So what you do in your own church and in your own home, keep that to yourself, but in the public sphere we need to take those languages away. And that's how things operate now. But what you'll find, if you think about it more, we're moving out of that now. I think religion has become privatized, but now religion is coming back into the public sphere. It's just that it's not the Catholic religion; it's other religions. I'm not talking about Islam. I'm talking about